Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture, and this is the sort of episode I actually like putting together more than most. More projects that I really like, and even if I'm lukewarm on them, there's still plenty for me to say, even if it might take us all over the place, and a lot of what we have here seems to touch on, well, dealing with the past couple of years. But no more wasting time, let's get on the pulse. So before we go any further, if you would like to like and subscribe, I would be extremely grateful. With these sort of larger compilations of a lot of albums together, they don't always get a lot of traffic. If you share it, that can change. But now onto the matter at hand, we got 6 projects on the docket. Let's first go back and talk about, from Sharon Van Etten, We've Been Going About This All Wrong. I think the arc of my reviews of Sharon Van Etten's music has been a cycle of acknowledging tremendous potential as a performer and as a strong songwriter, but for as much as she's changed up her sound and production, she's never consistently found that niche that would allow her to knock one out of the park. The closest she got was on Tramp or Epic nearly 10 years ago, and it's so exasperating because she's often so damn close. But then last year, she dropped a collab single, Like I Used To, with Angel Olsen, and it was excellent. John Congleton balanced the two of them out masterfully, with the acoustics letting their huge voices swell for the sort of terrific indie power ballad that many would call one of the best individual songs of 2021. And while I personally wouldn't agree, I get it, it's a great song. So naturally, the course for the new album is not to include it, and instead work with Daniel Knowles, who produced a song for her on the Velvet Underground and Nico tribute album from last year, actually featuring Angel Olsen on backing vocals, fun fact. And otherwise, well, Knowles is most well known for being a well-connected live sound engineer and the former guitarist of the shoegaze band Amusement Parks on Fire. Suffice to say, I had some concerns going in with this, and I was kinda right too, because unfortunately what potential this album could have had is wrecked by the production. I've talked about how it can be very difficult to produce for singers with huge, unique voices like Van Etten's, and in theory, Knowles' choice to ramp up the electric sizzle alongside the blaring synths and lumbering percussion, it's not a bad idea. Give her a storm to ride, really drive it home. But at every point it feels like something went wrong here. The mix feels cluttered, weirdly muffled in patches, and increasingly unable to build to a coherent melody behind Van Etten. And there wasn't even an attempt to solve the groove issues from Remind Me Tomorrow. If anything, they've got worse, courtesy of the increasingly stiff and thin percussion that only seems to emphasize how inert and blocky all these arrangements sound. But what's considerably worse, the vocal mixing. If the mix is not spare or emptied out of elements like on the couple ballads that we do get, Sharon Van Etten is placed midway into the cacophony where it seems like she's fighting for air, much less commanding the mix, made all the worse by this being the project where she chose to opt for her most husky and breathy delivery to date, so she sounds even more suffocated. So even on songs where the hook might materialize, nobody's really equipped to capitalize on it properly. So minus the visceral force and the intensity, I'm stuck going to the writing, which has always been characterized by a certain very stripped back, very direct purity. But given that she's now a mother who settled in California amidst the numbing isolation of the pandemic and the wildfires, her focus by necessity has to expand outside of herself. The uneasy balance between her career on the road and the reality of raising her son amidst a world that's spiraling out of control. It's an album that wants to force her to drill into insecurities, untangle past traumas, test her current relationship to the limits, and like on previous albums, it leans on the subtext to fill in the unsaid gaps. And while I can appreciate the anxious, messy headspace an album like this is built to cultivate, it's not exactly unique among records coming out in the pandemic, and the climax points never really explode, which leaves the project wallowing in tension where the release is more restrained and wistful. And yeah, you know what, that kind of makes sense. It's less raw, but it's more mature, and the fact that it ultimately lands on an optimistic point, it is good in its favor, but at least for me it doesn't flatter the strength Sharon Van Etten showcased before, especially when you get the feeling there are some intended explosive moments that don't actually go off. So yeah, I'm actually cooler on this than I want to be. No one song here matches her best, but I'm not going to call it bad either. Pretty decent, I just wanted to like it more. Next up from Gospel, The Loser. So by now you should all be familiar with my reticence towards a lot of post-hardcore and math rock, more the latter subgenre, but when it's short on structured melody or competent production, a lot of it just really runs together and doesn't really click much with me. So when I heard that Gospel was being highlighted as one of the most influential bands within the scene that I wasn't all that familiar with, I was bracing myself when I went back to their previous One and Done 2005 album, and yet while it's very much of its time, I was shocked how much I wound up really liking it. Definitely more of a progenitor to sounds that other bands in post-hardcore and screamo would do better and then drive into the ground, but it was well balanced in the atmospherics, frenetic and howling while still being very tuneful and remarkably well produced for the time, generally really damn solid. So I actually found myself a little excited for this comeback 17 years later, even though I wasn't around for it in 2005. And well, I guess I shouldn't be surprised that it's a bit of a pivot. I'm a little more shocked, though, that they actually stuck the landing. What it reminds me a bit of is when the avant-garde metal band Cynic came back over a decade after their debut with Trace Air, with a shift towards a sound that's more measured and progressive, compared to the initial manic raw experimentation of their debut Focus, which for Gospel shows them easing back a little on the screamo and the post-hardcore atmospherics for, well, keyboard-saturated, math rock-adjacent progressive metal that captures a lot of the same loose compositional strengths. And that's pretty damn sweet. The melodic core is still strong. This is a band that did not feel the need to go for djent, and that's absolutely a plus. The guitar work is legit terrific. This is not a band that lets math rock wank keep them away from strong motifs and good hooks. And getting Kurt Ballou of Converge in to assist with the production, absolutely the right call, especially on cuts like the sizzlingly progressive album centerpiece S.R.O. But there is a textural difference that comes with a little bit more clean vocals, a little bit more of a saturated mix off the analog keyboard and organ swells that might not give everything the same chance to breathe, and might even seem a little backwards looking or dated in the way that their debut really isn't. And while I appreciate how they worked in the careening cascades of Hyper, or how the organ drove the crescendos on Bravo, and especially Metallic Olives, or how they really set up the slower melancholy of the Grinderman-esque Warm Bed as the closer, I do understand how this won't be for everyone, especially when it feels a little bit more seedy and unstructured like on Tango, a song that's nearly a decade old and they could have easily cut it. That being said, I actually do appreciate the lyrics here. They obviously take less of a focus, but for an album grappling with aging in a decaying world where nothing seems to be actually getting better, they know that a sheer bullheaded return is strapped with a lot of arrogance. Why do people care they're coming back? Especially when many are just comfortable in their blind consumption, and this album is racked with guilt at potentially feeding into it. It's losers all the way down, and they don't exclude themselves. So ultimately a pretty bleak album, all things considered, but when the melodies are so robust, it's the sort of comeback that's kind of hard for me to deny. Frankly, better than it has any right to be, and considering this is more accessible on some level, even worth a shot even if you didn't hear their debut in the 2000s. Great stuff, check it out. Next up from Everything Everything, Raw Data Feel. Okay, so the last time I covered Everything Everything in 2020, I talked about the band being on the wrong side of the one and done indie hype cycle, and that became a lead into an album that frustrated the hell out of me for its obvious Radiohead worship and a lot of thematic ideas that had potential but didn't coalesce into more. And thus I was kind of stunned that folks actually wanted me to cover their newest project. This got more votes on Patreon than anything else on my schedule this week. Y'all sure you want me to go through this again? Well, turns out I kind of get why. Because this might be the best thing they've released since Get to Heaven, and yet for precisely the opposite reasons that album worked at all. If anything, I'm reminded a little bit of the pivot that Steven Wilson has made in his solo work in embracing a bit more pop accessibility in the compositions and texture in order to match his progressive tendencies in song structure and melody. And for Everything Everything, that means falling somewhere between the wonky theatricality of a band like Sparks and the warping alternative dance grooves that are all over the UK and a little bit more glitchy in a Jack Garrett mold, but ultimately are a lot smoother and better balanced. Melodically, this album still has a lot of the off-kilter prog elements, but on a textural level, the choices of synths and guitars are smoother, they flow more naturally together, where even the weirder moments made inevitable by Jonathan Higgs's unique delivery, it's less obnoxious and turgid. Now, the album is a bit longer than it can get away with. It's hard to keep up this sort of momentum for nearly an hour, and I think the closer is a bit weak. And I can see some thinking that this is everything, embracing a lot of buoyant synthwave and dance elements as a play for more mainstream attention, given the critics have moved on. Or at least mimic what Muse were trying with Simulation Theory, especially as you can say they're not really pushing the envelope within these sounds and genres. It's closer to peak the 1975 or Future Islands than their more challenging art rock that they had on Get to Heaven. But on the flip side, when you have some of your strongest melodic hooks ever on songs like Teletype, Shark Week, and especially My Computer, and cleaning up the production got rid of most of the lingering instrumental issues, it's kind of hard for me to complain. But while we're in this territory, let's talk about content. A lot has been made about everything utilizing AI to craft some of the more batshit lyrics on this album. Shark Week with that Obama-Osama line springs to mind, and pretty much all of Hex. But considering this is an album circling ideas of how we deflect and retreat from trauma, especially in childhood, and enmeshed within the demented abstraction of the internet the past couple of years hanging very heavily in the background, the more personal stakes and framing, they coalesce more effectively. Plus, it's less pop culture free association word salad than a weirdness that feels kind of directed, even if it is from AI, and that's a lesson the 1975 never learned. Funnily enough, this isn't actually that far removed from ideas and framing on Reanimator, especially given how all this flies in the face of rationality in confronting your demons, instead retreating into reckless flights of hedonism and consumption. But this is also where embracing a more earnest, populist framing really helps everything, blunting some of the darker detachment that could feel so standoffish, and adding some emotional complexity in all these coping mechanisms. As you can tell, the scenes actually wind up striking a little closer to home, and there is no clean ending with all the answers. Ironically, for an album that embraces more technology than ever, it's easily the most emotionally resonant, dare I even say human. And while I'm not sure I would say it's better than Get to Heaven, I sure as hell know I'm gonna go back to this a lot more. What a surprise, great album. I'd give this man another chance. Next up from Quelle Chris, Deathfame.
Hearts broken, no minutes, still gotta fuck some commas up. Promise we never wind up in Romulus. The roll Manila now, niggas feeling lost in Acropolis.
So as much as everyone seemed to only focus on Kendrick Lamar dropping, there were two other projects that deserve some real scrutiny that came out on the same day, even in hip-hop. And this Quelle Chris album had me intrigued. I've been a fan for years now, and reportedly with a return to production closer to Shotgun and Sleek Rifle, but bringing his tuneful side developed in recent years, it was set up to be pretty damn great, and it is, but in a different way than you might expect. In comparison with the broader conceptual experimentation of Quelle Chris's projects in recent years, this feels like a little closer to a back-to-basics detour, where he's back in the warbling, roiling murk of his early 2010s material, augmented with stronger melodies. So where alongside the lingering samples and pianos of So Tired You Can't Stop Dreaming, The Sky is Blue Because the Sunset is Red, and the twinkling of the title track, you get the swaggering fat low end on Feed the Heads and the Agency of the Future, and the drums on King in Black, they sound like distorted trash cans off that subtle piano, and the bass line, it just feels corpulent. And there are more textured parallels to New York underground acts in recent years, like Mike and Navy Blue, even a bit of Earl Sweatshirt, where Quelle Chris comes across as the haggard veteran with dry wit and knowing eyes, who is still very much hungry but feels the weight of everything around him only getting heavier. And that feeds into the looser thematic arc of the album. How many rappers, especially in the underground, only get famous or acclaim after death? And that's not something Quelle Chris remotely wants. He's in the game right goddamn now, and even if he can see darkness around every corner, from violent environments to his own struggles with alcoholism and a lingering disappointment of getting a lot of his plans thrown off course thanks to the last 2 years, there's just this dogged undercurrent of gallows humor that drives the project forward, even if it all feels very murky and haunted. Detachment might be envied, or hell, just escape. But he's been forced to confront his own demons the past few years. He's got to keep it moving. Where there was a forced shift because of pandemic lockdowns and canceled tours, it doesn't really feel like a pandemic album so much as one that has to confront this lingering adrift feeling. And if you wind up drinking too much over the past couple of years and have felt things stall out before any conceivable control, yeah, there are moments that are going to hit way harder than you might expect, especially so tired you can't stop dreaming and the sky is blue because the sunset is red. This also easily makes it Quelle Chris's most straightforward and direct album in years, helped along with a lot of the sampled instrumental interludes that kind of slip in between songs, and I'm not always sure it helps the pacing of a pretty heavy and kind of slow-paced project, and how much he embraces a lot of his own singing, like on the humid keys of Alive Ain't Always Living, or just outright crooning on How Could They Love Something Like Me, where his very nasal drawl just winds up endlessly charming. Now that being said, this is the sort of album that has to sit with you before it just sits on you. And like with Mike's work, I'm not always sure that the slower, weightier moments connect as powerfully as they could, especially as the writing seems to be fainting around a lot of the angst rather than hitting it directly. It strips away a lot of Quelle Chris's flourishes for something that's more downbeat and textured, and that does make it a bit of a tougher album to revisit as a whole. Still, like with every Quelle Chris album, it grows on me with every listen. And while I don't think I love it as much as Guns or Everything's Fine or even Innocent Country 2, still low-key great. Went slept on, thank a lot, Kendrick. But yeah, check it out. Next up from Florence the Machine, Dance Fever.
Picks me up, puts me down, picks me up, puts me down, 100 times a day.
You know, it's funny. Midway through Kendrick Lamar's album on We Cry Together, we got a very obvious sample of June, a song from Florence and the Machine's High as Hope. And I still thought that was the band's best album, an opinion only reinforced by seeing them live back in 2018 with Grizzly Bear. So maybe it just happened to be a sweet coincidence that they just so happened to drop an album on the same day as Kendrick Lamar, which in certain spheres was getting as much critical acclaim, if not more. And you know, while I think this is pretty damn great, I find myself divided on whether it actually matches High as Hope. Now, the biggest leap forward is with Florence Welch. She's always had a huge expressive presence, but more than ever, she's embracing these thicker, borderline biblical swells in the vocal arrangements that are really doing more work than ever on this project, which is a lot more percussive and expansive. And that's before she bends into parts of her register that sound intentionally rougher, like on the strikingly effective interlude Restraint. It's also by far the most confrontational that Florence Welch's writing has ever been, and that's a big compliment, as while the anxieties of the pandemic and isolation and social unrest has inflamed her emotions, this is where she's probably the most conscious and politically charged she's ever been, leaning into iconography of witches and Cassandra and a strident feminine presence that doesn't shape to morality, challenging toxic and manipulative male figures, but also the systems behind them like organized religion. But it also digs into the complexities of femininity, her own tempestuous nature as a recovering alcoholic warring against insecurities she knows can be exploited in the systems of toxic masculinity, but also how she's feeling the increasing divide over choosing a family over a career, which feels all the more precarious given the times. In other words, it's about the closest that Florence Welch has gotten to making a lingua ignota album, especially given the vocal arrangements and how ragged some of the melodic fragments and textures that she claws together around herself. And while it's nowhere near as intense or as literary, she still has her poppy side that allows for the huge dramatic populist swell, where songs like Free, Choromania, Cassandra, Daffodil, and My Love, they all swing for the fences and they kick a lot of ass. And while allowing for a terrific ballad as a closer with Morning Elvis that finds her plenty of rough edges, but also able to make the stage and save both her audience, maybe even herself as well. That being said, there are issues, the first being that the influences are kind of impossible to ignore. This has been an issue with Florence and the Machine for years now, and while I doubt lingua ignota is intentionally one, the most recent Fiona Apple has fingerprints all over this, especially in the rougher vocal arrangements and the percussion lines. But then there's the bigger issue. New producer, Jack Antonoff, and while he thankfully gives the mix more space, so we don't hit the oversaturation point of how big, how blue, how beautiful, the album has the same
same problem of marginalizing its instrumental melodies in order to support Florence in the mix. It's less of an issue than it was 7 years ago, because the vocal arrangements of the hooks are much better, and the ragged, aggressive presentation finally adds some welcome texture and grit to an album that feels more urgent. But between Lord, that Taylor Swift remake of Red, and this, Jack Antonoff is developing a reputation of leaving a mix empty rather than supplementing with more melody to flesh out the arrangement. And I found myself wishing there was a little bit more tune in some of these spaces, which might hold back any individual cut from feeling as anthemic as Hunger or What Kind of Man. Still, this is a great album. Folks who are more on board with How Big, How Blue, How Beautiful will likely adore this even more than Highest Hope. And while I can't ignore the influences, the band is finally in enough of its own lane to stand with power. Absolutely worth hearing. Check this out. And finally, from Harry Styles, Harry's House.
Your delicate point of view, I was thinking about you.
Maybe it's just me, but there's something about Harry Styles' career that's felt like a bait and switch. His self-titled debut and a lot of his image evoked so much retro rock styling with a couple great songs and enough refinement in performance that comes with being years as the main face of the boy band. He seemed built to be a rock star of the old school variety. But in the wake of Fine Line, it became hard to ignore there was a lot more flair than substance, where he had locked into a comfortable niche that would win on the charts, but certainly wasn't living up to all that initial promise. And thus with Harry's House, well, this was the point I realized I had to start lowering my expectations for this guy. But even on that note, I don't think this is very good. Part of the problem is that the very specific era of sonic influence that Harry Styles is drawing from, most notably the soft rock between 1979 and 1982, where disco was fading, synthpop was slowly breaking through, and the pop charts were generally pretty bad. Awash in easy listening schlock, fading 70s teen idols, what would wind up being called yacht rock, and a whole lot of outright crap. You might remember specific classic songs or artists from the charts of this era, but they were either underground or not as popular as you might remember. It's a rough era. Now the problem is that this is a mostly forgotten era in pop that predates a lot of Harry Styles' target demographic, and even maybe some of their parents. So while I might have the context of wondering why the hell he might want to bring this back with modern percussion and slightly more modern sensibilities, to me this once again feels like a retro pastiche where not only is it not new, it's the least interesting sound that Harry Styles has tapped to date, full of goopy guitars and synths, staccato grooves off the programmed percussion, and increasingly tepid hooks only saved by the occasional good bass line, like the Destroyer ripoffs of Cinema and Satellite, or the jagged spark of rougher guitars that never properly ignite. Daylight being probably one of the most exasperating examples with that fuzz guitar. And this is where I also find some of those comparisons to Prince and David Bowie a little bit offensive this time, because vocally Harry Styles has gone into his breathy upper register and falsetto, neither of which were all that impressive, and they only get worse the more synthetic filters he runs them through, or this dazed, half-engaged crooning where he's clearly trying to sound like he's not trying. The only place where it's tolerable is when he stacks the vocals up for richer harmonies, like on the sultry Lil Freak, or the tender acoustic ballad Matilda, or he cuts loose on the end of Daydreaming, but let's be real, it's few and far between, and there's no hook on this album with the immediacy of even the better singles on Fine Line. But okay, fine. It becomes very obvious with repeated listens, this is not trying to be an immediate album. It's not trying nearly as much at all. It's languid, it's chill, all about the vibes, man. Where even As It Was lyrically focuses on hazy stasis as it splits its difference between early Aha and the classic 2015 Lower Den song To Die in LA. And on some level I get how it works. I might not like the sound that Harry Styles is using, but it's a very well produced version of it. And even if the lyrical output feels completely shallow beyond fleeting love songs, hazy memories of debauchery just out of frame, and a tired longing that'll work for hot and humid late afternoons halfway through a bottle of wine, there's a place for that too. It's not precisely bad, but Harry Styles has the potential to make more than just this, coasting on charisma and vibes. And put aside all the weird food details that crop all over this album and aren't nearly as sexy as he thinks they are, especially on the opening track, give these songs to any other writer in pop, I don't think anyone would care. I mean, he's built his house. I'm sure he's quite comfortable. I'm just not that interested in visiting all that often. so hit and miss at best. But yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be extremely grateful. Had a lot to get through here and a lot to say, and honestly a lot of great albums outside the very end there, but hey, if you guys are interested, please go check them out, or if you've got comments, leave them down there below. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get involved in my scheduling process, or hell, just actually get involved, chat with me on Discord, support the channel, link to my Patreon right over there. Don't feel obligated, I know, tough times out there, but options available. Till then, I'm Mark, you're watching On the Pulse on Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.